okay? And you don't have to limit your questions to the Freedom of Information Act or the right to know. We're here. You can ask us anything you like. So the government efforts in Malta are particularly problematic because of the media landscape that we have. It's quite unique in Europe. It is dominated by political party ownership. There is only a handful of independent media operating in the country. The editors of these independent newsrooms have written editorials saying that they are increasingly dependent on government advertising. COVID has made the situation worse because we all had severe challenges in keeping our newsrooms alive. The government distributed funds. Again, a lack of transparency. We don't know who was given what was agreed. We're not saying necessarily something bad happened, we're just saying that these things should not happen this way. State funding of the media can be a good thing, but it has to be done according to set rules, criteria, and a transparent process. So the problem that we have when government is not giving information is because of the dominance you have with political party media, the dominance of government in the media landscape in terms of, it's a political party that owns its own media. It controls PBS, public broadcasting, the money it spends on social media, on the groups, on its advertising, on the dominance of the space on social media as well. So it becomes very difficult for independent newsrooms to push forward. And sometimes investigations that take weeks and months. You release your first story and you drown out. And because this is coupled with a lack of media literacy in the country, because obviously it serves the political parties that there is less questioning and criticism of what is going on. This becomes a very problematic situation in the country. That is why the Shift refuses any funding or donations from any political party or government. We survive on the donations from our readers and through international grants and events that we organize, and that ensures our independence, and that ensures that we work only for you and nobody else. Here I'm going to bring in Rebecca. You've been in Malta for the last 5 years. You're very aware of the challenges that we are facing. You have supported, as Reporters Without Borders, our Freedom of Information campaign. We are battling at the moment 42 cases at the Appeals Tribunal, 5 cases in court. It was an immense pressure. We had to raise a lot of money within a short period of time. It was a very clear attempt by the government to intimidate and harass. And it is only thanks to the help we received from you and organizations like Reporters Without Borders that we could actually proceed with the campaign. In your view, what is the impact on this effort and expense that the government is putting into blocking access to information in the country? How does it affect the news that people read?
Thanks, Caroline, and it's really a pleasure to be here. It's nice to see some of the Shift's readers in person. Often I'm reading these stories from London or Paris. I do get here as often as I can, as Caroline said. I want to make it clear from the outset that Reporters Without Borders is really proud to partner with the Shift, and we do support this battle for your right to know. And it's not just, of course, the right of the Shift to know or the right of journalists to know, but the right of every person here, every person in this country to have this information. It is certainly public interest information. It is information that you need to be able to scrutinize government, to hold power to account, to vote in an informed way. This is a point I really emphasize in various country contexts because I think sometimes it can be a question of just journalists' rights, just the ability of journalists to do their jobs, but it's how it impacts everybody. And I want to note as well that Reporters Without Borders is one of a kind of collaborative network of international NGOs that is standing in support of the shift in this way. It is not just the shift's battle, it is a battle for freedom of information in Malta. It is a battle that will impact other media, whether or not they're currently standing in solidarity with the shift. It impacts their ability to do their jobs too. We've been really disturbed by a deterioration in freedom of information in particular in this country. Some of you may be aware of Reporters Without Borders World Press Freedom Index. Of course, Daphne Caruana Galizia's assassination shed light onto some bigger systemic problems, and that resulted in a decrease in the rank of Malta in our index, but also there has been further deterioration in those years. So Malta is currently 87th out of 180 countries in our, 78th this year out of 180 countries in our World Press Freedom Index, which is a poor ranking within Europe, I must say. That's 31 places lower than before Daphne was assassinated. And although there's been progress in some areas and progress towards justice in the case in some areas in particular, I think FOI is one of those areas that has not improved. And I would actually say, based on our work with journalists on the ground here, that the climate for freedom of information has gotten more difficult since Rebecca Vella has come into office. So perhaps he has been less outwardly hostile towards media than his predecessor in some ways, but journalists across the board have told us it is more difficult to get information from this administration than before. So now we see these legal cases. I mean, this is absurd that 40 governmental entities would file lawsuits against one small independent media outlet. Why? What are they trying to hide? Is it just the information in these cases, or is it a point of principle? Because I would suggest the latter. Every time a journalist or a media outlet is forced to fight these types of battles, it sends a signal to others. I mean, it's not just the financial aspects, and I know that has been a cause of stress for Caroline in her work. I know how grateful she has been for the crowd support in particular. But it's sort of, it ties up the ability of journalists to do their jobs. It diverts resources from actual reporting. Malta is not the only country with a difficult, freedom of information environment, but we see this. Journalists become sort of used to, as part of parcel of their jobs, having to fight these battles. It actually can result in self-censorship as well, because journalists will know that it's probably more trouble than it's worth to get certain types of information and just stop trying. So it's really important that when courageous battles, and this is a courageous battle, is fought like this, that we support these journalists, because it will impact everybody. And it does impact the wider press freedom environment quite a lot.
Thank you. We are joined by Corinne. The Daphne Caruana Galizia Foundation has filed a constitutional case for reform of the Freedom of Information Act. Could you tell us more about it, what you're expecting and why it's important?
I'd like to start by apologising for being so late. I had to dump my car in a traffic jam and walk the rest of the way. That's why it took so long to get here. Yes, so the foundation has filed this case, constitutional case. It was filed through a network of lawyers that was set up by the foundation to provide access to justice and drive forward legal changes through the mechanisms of the legal system here. So it's actually using the legal system to improve the situation for everybody. The principle of the case is that the Freedom of Information Act itself is in conflict with the right to freedom of information. That provisions within that act are in conflict with principles in the Constitution. So the basis of the claim in the case is that the Act is not in line with the rights guaranteed by Malta's Constitution. That obviously has to be tested by the courts themselves, and evidence has to be provided to that effect, and the case has to run its course. But it's not as if we need the courts to tell us that it's difficult to get information, clearly, because from everybody's experience, anyone who's used the FOI Act to get information finds themselves in this uphill battle, and it takes about 2 years to complete the process. And anybody who works in the news knows that there's nowhere near fast enough for information you need for today's news. You might find yourself pushing uphill against that system simply to get the information and establish a point of principle. And then perhaps at the end of it, you might get information that could be useful, but by that time, certainly it's no longer news. So what does the constitutional case hope to achieve? If it succeeds, it will effectively have to change the Freedom of Information Act. And then the Freedom of Information Act could no longer be abused to hide information that will be forced to do the job of actually giving people access to information to which they already have a right. And maybe I'm preaching to the converted here, but a lot of people don't realize that the default position is that you have a right to information. And the FOI Act is simply a vehicle to give you access to that information, which is held by government entities or by state authorities, simply because they are the ones in charge of those particular sets of records. But in default, they owe you that information, because as a member of the public, it is your right to have that information. And the excuses that people receive why that information should not be released, need to be seen to be believed. And despite the repeated experience of being told, this violates, privacy, or it's not in conflict with the Freedom of Information Act, or it's not in public interest, and so on. Those excuses are used repeatedly to withhold information, which has the adverse effect of convincing you even more that that information is worth publishing, because if there's nothing wrong with it, and if it's perfectly benign and has no implications for the state authority that holds it, then why are they hiding it? Why don't they just publish it themselves? You see? Now it's going to be a long haul, because as you know, the court system is itself not very efficient, but if it succeeds, it could make a huge difference to everybody.
Perhaps it's important to explain a bit the process, what we go through. So you file the request, that's pretty straightforward. You wait 20 days. And on the very last day, they can extend up to another 40 days. So you wait the 40 days. Generally, the go-to is refusal. So remember, more than a month has passed. So the story is already done. And then what we do when it's a particularly important case, we appeal to the Data Protection Commission to investigate. When, in the cases where he rules in our favor and orders the release of the information, very often you get government appealing a decision of its own government-appointed body. So we go to the tribunal. Again, you need lawyers, you need time, you need resources. You get there. Even when the appeals tribunal rules in your favor, again, chaired by a person appointed by the government, even when that person rules in your favor a second time, they then take it to court, which is a whole other level. The expense multiplies, the time, and then all the same case go to one judge. He rules yes or no, or no or no. And what are you left with at the end of a 2-year process if he rules no? Nothing. As citizens, we don't have the possibility to appeal. Whereas the government is breaking its own records in appealing its own decisions. So this is how ridiculous the situation is. And understand how important it is in a context where we're not getting. For example, we wouldn't have known that Carmen Chantar, Chris Fern's, the Deputy Prime Minister's right-hand person, had a salary of 163,000 euros. We wouldn't know that the AFM commander was shifted to a public authority on a salary of 100,000 euros. We wouldn't know most of these things, and you're getting to know these things, although that's not everything that we can know, but this is what we're trying. These bits of information take weeks and months for us to get. I mean, the minute you have an appointment, you should have an announcement. This is what transparency is all about. So all this effort is wasting the time of newsrooms, of civil society movements, international organizations, because there was even Access Info Europe who had to file a case in court because they were denied information because they were not a resident of Malta. We have molded this FOI Act to make sure we don't give information, not to make sure we give it. And this is why this matter is so important. Recently you had a success with the Electrogas Freedom of Information request. That's important because we've been investigating this for 4 years now, 5 years. And scenes in Parliament of the contract being redacted and torn out. And it's taken this long to get the contract on the deal.
It wasn't a contract on the deal, it was a side contract on the deal. It was an agreement that was kept hidden deliberately to allow the complex process to move forward in the interests of the people behind the project. Let's put it that way. So the existence of the agreement was kept covert. And then when that became known and we asked for it, it was refused, as you said, through these multiple extensions and refusals and argumentation, which made no sense. And eventually the Information and Data Protection Commissioner ruled in the Foundation's favour. And we published a statement outlining what had happened, and we ended it with the government has a choice of giving us the documents or filing an appeal. And in the end, they handed over the documents. So there can be successes, but it is an ordeal to get there. And while that was happening, other decisions were being taken which were favourable, and we did get the documents as well. In the wider scheme of things, they might excite a lot of interest, but they're not necessarily the most significant things. But at the same time as those successes were being achieved, there were other mechanisms that were getting in the way. A recent request we filed was for a copy of the report presented to government by the committee of experts it set up itself in the wake of the public inquiry into Daphne's assassination. The government's own terms of reference clearly state that the reports it receives will be tabled in Parliament within 10 days. They received the report on the 1st of June. Parliament was still open. They did not table the report. And Parliament closed for the summer. But that can't be used as an excuse, because tabling in Parliament is simply a form of publication, and other means of publication are available to government. Principally, it's the Department of Information that issues press releases by the dozen on a daily basis, including infamously one by Konrad Mitzi claiming he had a very strong marriage, and that apparently was some form of defense against in a libel suit. So we know that mechanisms are at government's disposal and they use them, but they also avoid using them when it doesn't suit them. So while we were waiting for this report to be published as per the government's terms of reference, and it wasn't happening, in the middle of the summer we filed an FOI request. We received a reply on the last day saying that it requires further consideration and the period of reference is going to be extended, and they need to consult third parties, and it's going to be referred to another department and so on. We knew that it's going to be a long haul if we follow this process, only they disrupted their own process of obfuscation by calling a press conference and issuing the report publicly themselves, and that was just the day after they sent that reply, which begs the question, why send that kind of reply when you're already lining up a press conference to publish the report yourself? Why not simply say, we'll get back to you tomorrow, or something of the sort, you see? So it's in every action, both the overt and the covert actions are very clearly about being on the defensive. And sometimes the information being defended isn't necessarily worth defending. I mean, why hide a report which you're going to publish anyway? Why do that? Well, not really, because the narrative is you're refusing a freedom of information request, which is perfectly legitimate, perfectly in line with the terms of reference you drafted yourself, and you very next day you publish that report. So obviously you are acting in bad faith. Why do it?
Can I make a suggestion?
Sure.
Possibly it's part of the hostility towards the media that we often see from this government, okay? And this feeds into the broader climate. That's why I say that these sorts of battles impact the broader climate. I mean, this government in a number of ways has shown just really a disdain at times, especially for journalists that are reporting on issues that they prefer not to be dug into. So it's part of that. And so, you're right, it doesn't make sense on the surface, but it's part of that. It's part of showing that, that they control the information that's disclosed, and, a kind of lack of respect for the role of media, and, just making things unnecessarily difficult, even to do your job in small, everyday ways. But those are those small issues really can impact the ability of journalists to do their job. How much time in your newsroom is tied up just with these small issues, trying to just confirm facts for even one story? And this is repeated in every newsroom in this country.
I have a few more questions for you, but I want to see if anybody in the audience has anything to ask at this point. Just read. Annika?
Things that I'm fine.
One second, you're getting a mic. Unless everybody can hear you.
One of the things that I find is that we're dealing with government, right? Open has a lot of has our funds that it's fighting journalists with. So So it's not really a fair battle, so to speak. But there's an individual taking those decisions who's basically saying no. I mean, isn't it about time that if these decisions are abusive, that people are made personally accountable? If they are made personally accountable, then maybe they'd be a little bit more hesitant to be abusive in the use of their powers. So, I mean, obviously that goes back to your court case, to the law being changed, to actually people being accountable, these public servants at the end of the day, because they are in our service.
Yes, we've had this discussion as well before about libel cases as well. I touched upon the issue with the FOI Act in the sense that the government has so much power and we have no opportunity for redress. It's important to say that the Information and Data Protection Commissioner himself, Ian Daguara, has spoken publicly about the need for reform. And he has said, remove the right for government to appeal the decision. Was very clear about that. And he's saying that the criteria on which the FOI Act is based do not subscribe to the public interest test. Okay, they don't meet those criteria. In the recommendations by the judges, the public inquiry on Daphne Caruana and Galizia's assassination also referred to the FOI Act, and also said the government must limit the reasons why it does not give information. That the spirit is that you give information and it's an exception that you deny it, not the way it is being played out right now. Now we've had the government announce last week a set of media reform laws. Now we know we're all happy with them, but one of the things that struck me there that again the government ignored a lot of the recommendations made by the judges of the public inquiry, and it was through the committee that, again, but you have another sentence that is very broad, that may be applicable or maybe not. This process, we all know it took 2 years just to get the public inquiry started. It was a difficult process. We got there. There's a holistic set of recommendations that, if implemented, would really, really go a long way in creating the reform that we need in the country. What is your impression of how we're going about this? Are we on the right track? Are we not? Even beyond the FOI.
Well, from our view at Reporters Without Borders, and again, we work closely with a number of other INGOs that have been working in the campaign for justice for Daphne and Look at Malta. I have to say, we're extremely frustrated by the current situation. The public inquiry was truly landmark. It was a victory of sustained advocacy over a couple of years, as you said, and that was, I mean, a multifaceted effort by your family, Corinne, by local civil society here, by international NGOs. Finally, the Council of Europe played a key role in that too, and the administration of Joseph Muscat was basically dragged into that kicking and screaming, but we finally got the public inquiry. It was robust in the end. The board of inquiry was independent. It did its job. We also testified to it from Reporters Without Borders and also from the broader NGO community, and the recommendations were excellent, robust and thorough. And Malta had, and I would say just, although it's dwindling now, still has an opportunity for that to really serve as a model for how countries could respond to such situations and such cases, particularly at the European level. But it all rests on implementation, and that is where the trouble started. Not just with this law now, but I have to say with how the committee was selected, the composition of the committee, which we have voiced a number of times, was not chosen in a transparent manner. The government did not take up the offer of our groups, the sort of international NGOs that are working together on this. We offered technical assistance in setting this up. And the composition of the committee lacks the independence and expertise that we felt was needed to address the full range of recommendations of the public inquiry report. So that's where things stood. Then there's been a lack of transparency in how the committee has operated, and then of course in this report, as Corinne mentioned, And now we have indeed a very problematic piece of legislation that in some ways could make things worse. In all of our work around the world, and certainly the 6 years now that I've been at Reporters Without Borders, I can't think of an example of another country where we know so much about what went wrong and what needs to be done, but also where those very things are not being done. It's not just the recommendations of the public inquiry. There's a body now of international reports by credible expert bodies, including bodies of the European Union, the Council of Europe. We know so much now about why what happened, and what needs to be done to ensure that it can never happen again. Nobody should ever be left in the position that Daphne was. No journalist, nobody else should ever be left exposed and facing such risks. We know that Malta needs stronger democratic institutions. We know what that should look like. This government knows, and they're not doing this. And so far, we don't have enough concrete action at the international level to hold them to account for actual implementation. So that's the situation that we're at now. It's not just the media law, it's a broader issue. And the people of Malta deserve better. The media plays such a key role in this because, of course, that's how the public is informed. And so the angle that we work on kind of feeds this broader situation. But I don't think it's too late. I think it could be corrected, starting with how this piece of legislation is now scrutinized. I know there's been calls for an open public consultation on that. That should certainly happen. But really, all of this boils down to political will of this government to actually do what is needed. So again, they know, and we're calling on them to implement the recommendations of the public inquiry and the broader reforms that are needed.
What I can add to that is that the whole process has been wrapped in secrecy, and that is primarily the problem. Because what is the protection of journalists in the end? It's about the protection of the right to know. And we're protecting the right to know by hiding information from the very people whom those new laws are meant to protect. We had a ridiculous situation where a press conference is called to announce reforms that are meant to protect journalists and who are being told that they have been consulted, and that entire room full of people had not been consulted at all. So the report and the legislation was distributing at that point and then presented in Parliament, but it's not on the Parliament website, it's not on the legislation website, and you cannot get a copy of it. So what was distributed last week isn't necessarily what was tabled in Parliament. We don't know what that legislation says. What we do know is it could be rushed through simply because the government has a majority. But the very people it is meant to protect, both directly the journalists supposedly going to protect, and the wider protection of the right to know, we don't know what those laws are going to say. We won't know until they happen. Because it's not on the website, and nobody has a copy. And we can't get one, we don't know anyone who can give us one. I mean, if that doesn't say everything you need to know, then what does? And as for the claims of public consultation, I do not understand how a government can repeatedly claim to have consulted international NGOs on those very same international NGOs, have been ignored, have publicly declared their offer of technical assistance more than once, and publicly making that public declaration showing that that offer was not taken up. If you offer technical assistance and the offer is not taken up, how do you claim that those NGOs have been consulted? There were claims that family had been consulted. Family was not consulted, and that's not the point anyway. You don't use a dead journalist's family to justify the malfeasance of pushing through legislation that is clearly inadequate for the task it is meant to achieve. The test of whether that legislation is effective is very, very simple. Will it stop a journalist getting killed? This is in the end what the public inquiry was about. An investigation by the state into its own failure to protect somebody's life. That very same inquiry found that the state is responsible for Daphne's death, which is qualitatively different from saying that the state is criminally responsible for her death. But it is responsible for her death because of its multiple failures. And unless the changes to our laws and our institutions can prevent someone else's death, then they are not up to the task. And if you won't open that legislation to scrutiny, if you won't open the process of legislation itself to scrutiny, if you draft that legislation covertly, then you are acting in bad faith. How can you possibly deny the usefulness of multiple organizations working around the world on press freedom, offering technical and legal assistance to a process that is meant to achieve a task defined by a public inquiry that the like of which has never been carried out anywhere in the world? Malta has a chance to turn itself from a pariah into a positive example for Europe, and it's spitting on the opportunity by hiding information from the people it is meant to protect. You don't even need to get into the composition of the committee or even what the legislation says. The entire process is full of problems, and that itself speaks everything. It says everything right.
Thank you. Natalina, naqbad miegħek. You've recently launched the Media Reform Initiative. Perhaps obviously it comes out of consent, rises out of a consent, so perhaps you could explain those consents.
Okay, for those who don't know me, I was a journalist for a long time. I set up the independent media. Then I moved to the Times, and I was editor of the National Broadcasting Station for 5 years. And then with the change development, I was. Hello. Okay, it's fine. Okay. So I'm Natalina Fenek. For those who don't know me, I was a journalist for many years. I set up the independent with Daphne in Galizia in 1992. Then I moved to the Times, and from there I became editor and head of news at the national television station for 5 years. And with the change of government, I was moved aside when they started trying to interfere with the news, and I was resisting. So I was unceremoniously moved to university. Now I'm lecturing at MCAST, and I lecture in journalism and media. And we decided to form this media reform initiative. It's a loose group actually. There's Father Joe, Teresa and Monique, and Manuel Denia. Manuel is a blogger, Monique is a journalist, Father Joe is a former editor himself, and Teresa is a lawyer who specializes in media and human rights. And we felt that we had to push because, first of all, the press club itself, the IGM, was kind of bound by some kind of gentleman's agreement not to reveal what was being discussed. And we thought this is very stupid. The journalists bind themselves not to speak when usually we try to uncover things ourselves. So we felt that was a bit of a strange situation. And we decided to try to apply pressure for public consultation. And I'm not sure if I understood you correctly, Corinne, when you said that in the letter, government said they would be consulting on the reform initiative the day before they released the document, because.
You're talking about the FOI?
Yes.
Okay. So the FOI request we filed was to obtain a copy of the report that the committee of experts had given to government on the 1st of June. One day after we received the reply, it was published at a press conference. But the reply said to us that they need more time to reply to our request because they need to consult third parties. And the request had been filed with the Ministry of Justice because although the report was presented to the Office of the Prime Minister, we knew that the report was passed on to the Ministry of Justice because in an attempt to quell public criticism, there was a photo opportunity in which the Minister of Justice met with the President and Secretary of the Institute of Journalists and informed them that he had received the report and was, they were considering it. Which was very strange because the two people sitting across the table from the minister were themselves on the committee which gave the report to government. But the Minister of Justice needed a photo op, he got it, and that's how we knew he had the report. So we wrote to him and asked for it. And then at the end of the period within which he could reply, he wrote back and said he's referring it to the Office of the Prime Minister, and they need to extend the period to reply because they need to consult third parties. The third parties weren't identified.
So it was just a lie?
But we don't know it was a lie. Maybe at that point it was the truth, but I mean, it was absurd by any means.
Now it's a bill in Parliament, so I mean, if they wanted to consult, they could have consulted, or they could have said that they're going to consult. And my concern is that there's no
They could have given us the report. They should have published it 2 months earlier.
And my concern is twofold in this. So first, I want journalists to be better protected than we were, and than journalists are. And second, this is also a fight for democracy. Because without journalism, I mean, with the kind of journalism we have, we already have a lame democracy, let alone without journalism. So I think the concern is just one of democracy at the end of the day. Because we call ourselves a democratic country, but if we had to put our hands on hearts, is Malta still a democratic country?
But correct me if I'm wrong. The initiative that you've put together followed the efforts, the publication of the media also. What are your particular concerns in terms of what's missing there? Or?
Yeah, it's quite a lot is missing. We had a good analysis today by Elizabeth de Gaetano on the shift today.
Elizabeth, very senior.
Think about.
First, I mean, you don't protect journalists simply by stating principles. So the principles that you state have to have a bearing in law, because otherwise it's just empty words. The thing that the government is separating this Media Reform Act from a FOI, this should all be in one basket. There are so many things that are lacking. The fact that the government ignored only 13%, those 13% of recommendations that have been ignored, are the most important recommendations. I mean, there are some things in the law which, as a journalist, and maybe I'm going to be controversial here, but I don't agree that journalists are not accountable for what they do after their death. And I don't mean to offend anyone by this, but if an architect commits something which is very wrong and people die and something happens and this architect dies, does the case die with him? So should that be the case with journalists? I mean, that's a totally different argument. But
The same.
But the government, the way the government is trying to push this as if, you know, we're plugging a hole by solving this, and this is, I mean, we're trying to plug a little hole, which is an issue in Daphne's case, okay? But in most other cases, I've had cases of libel. I lost a criminal libel case, for example, against the person, because the police all the way were calling a different person. So when it came to judgment, they suddenly realized, the defense lawyer suddenly, oh, my client doesn't reside in this address. So now I'm convinced it wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate mistake, and we've seen so many deliberate mistakes in charges, in charge sheets. So basically, I believe in accountability, and journalists should be accountable for what they do. So the government is trying to patch some pieces to make this look good, and in other pieces, they're going to be bad for journalists in the long run.
Okay, just like to respond to that, but I have to take you back. It's interesting that you called it the media reform legislation. New legislation is not meant to reform the media, it's meant to reform the state. It's the state that failed to protect the journalist's life, not the media itself. But it's being pushed as media reform. It's as though the media themselves need reform. It's not the media that need reform. It's the state itself. And on the point you mentioned about journalists being accountable, you're mixing up two entirely different issues. Accountability of what sort? Libel is not about accountability. It is about punishing a journalist for daring to say something that the claimant does not want to be said. And when a libel case is inherited by a journalist's family, it is not about accountability by the journalist. A journalist who is dead cannot account for themselves. And if a dead journalist cannot account for herself, her sons and husband cannot account for her, because their primary witness is dead. Suing a journalist after her murder, 5 years after her murder, and expecting her sons and husband to answer for her writing, is a form of persecution that is totally unheard of in any democratic country. This is not about journalist accountability. The removal of the right to, the removal of inheritance of libel cases is not something that should even be discussed. It should simply be done. And you do not need a committee of experts, you do not need a public inquiry, you do not need anything to make that change. You just need someone to put it through Parliament and it will happen. And this is not about removing the right of Joseph Muscat to continue suing Daphne 5 years after she was killed. It is about protecting the freedom of a journalist to write without the fear that if that person gets killed, their family is going to pay for what they have written. That is what the change to legislation is about. That is not a mistake. That is the least that the government should be doing.
I just want to add as well, there's a difference between legitimate defamation lawsuits and SLAPs, strategic lawsuits against public participation. And it's our assessment that many, if not all of the cases against Daphne were examples of SLAP. In fact, because of what happened to Daphne here in this country now, internationally we all know more about SLAPs, and we're all working to counter it and to ensure effective protections in European legislation and in other countries. So that's not touched on by this bill. That's sort of a bigger picture issue. But Corinne is absolutely right that when we see cases like this, the intention is to silence, to send a clear message about what is acceptable to report on, what are the red lines, and others will take note. Nobody would want to go through what Daphne faced. And frankly, the fact that some of these suits remained open to this day. So who is it still? Joseph Muscat, Conrad Mitzi?
Joseph Muscat, Michel Muscat, Conrad Mitzi, Simon Mitzi, Lindsay Gambin, Mario Vella, and Alfred Mifsud. All of them representing either government, state authorities, or government cronies. Basically, if you go through all the slap cases that Daphne was facing when she was killed, and all of which were inherited by her family, except for the criminal defamation, more than 3/4 of those cases were filed either by people in government, their associates, their cronies, and their paymasters. That's all you need to know. And all of those cases had to be responded to by her husband and sons. They were summoned to court within days of Daphne's murder to step into her shoes. And every time there is a case, it is her name that is called, and they have to respond. And when Joseph Muscat's case came to court, he turned up unannounced to testify in the case he brought himself, turning up as Mr. Joe Citizen, but with his head of communications in government trailing behind him, tweeting live from the courtroom. And he stood on that witness stand and said he's willing to let go of the case if they accept the results of an inquiry. In other words, he wanted Daphne's family to call her a liar when she's not here to defend herself, so that he will not continue to persecute them after her death. And David Lindsay can attest to this. He contacted me for comment about, in reaction to Joseph Muscat's testimony, and the reply was, "We do not concede to extortion by our public servants." Because this is something that people like Muscat and people like him do not understand. They are not medieval kings. They are public servants in a democracy, and it is they, and not the people who write about them, who are accountable. Particularly after a journalist is killed.
Thank you, Caroline. Tom Welsh, former UK newspaper publisher. Can I bring the debate right back down to street level? In as much as about 18 months, maybe 2 years ago, I published, or Caroline published on my behalf, an article in the Shift News. The very next day, my wife and I went out for a drive, picked up a couple of things, came back to our underground garage, which we had locked up securely in our apartment block, and we found the doors open, the lights on, and a few other things out of place. The village I lived in, let me say it was quite a left-wing village, and the next time I was in the bar, I mentioned this to the bar manager, and he said to me, "Ah, yes, that's just a warning." Now, I'm bringing this debate back down to street level, but that's me just publishing something, or Caroline publishing on my behalf. Now, before I come to my point, I just want to say, I think it's absolutely magnificent that we've got three very, very strong females sitting here tonight. That would never have happened here or in many other places maybe 20, 30 years ago, and I'm very grateful to you all. My main point is derived from a phrase that Caroline knows I trail out often. There's a bit of apathy about, and people don't really want to know about things. And some things they do want to know about, and that's this difference between of interest to the public and in the public interest. Of interest to the public, of course, is perhaps a member of the government is having a fling with a secretary. That's of interest to the public. We all like a bit of gossip. But in the public interest is, who will be seriously disadvantaged if you don't know about this, right? And we in this room will all be seriously disadvantaged if we didn't know that our money that we pay in taxes was going in the back pockets of individuals who use the political ladder to make money. But right back to my comment, the thing that worries me most is the apathy in these islands. What do we do? Because there are people, and I think a lot of it might be down to the two-party system, but you can tell me better than you, but the majority of people just don't care. Am I wrong?
If I agree with you, I'm out of a job.
Apart from you.
I think we go back to the point that we started from. The dominance of the political parties in the media landscape, I think, is a major factor. The lack of media literacy is a major factor. So, you can't tell people. I think the scenes that we saw coming out of university yesterday were a good example of people following the example set. So at the end of the day, what do? We just sit back and say, you know what, this is what you voted for, this is what you deserve, then you might as well live with it. No, we can't, because it affects our quality of life as well. And it's one of the main reasons why we have to push forward, because if there isn't justice, if we still don't have justice in this case, how can we ever hope for justice in anything else? How can we hope to achieve the reform that we need? The public inquiry, I think, was such an excellent exercise, because the set of recommendations that they put forward, they were about the rule of law, about the checks and balances in a country. The media is part of that. It was a very holistic, and instead of the government saying, this was a really extensive exercise. So we don't need the government to be, in actual fact, consulting. We have the roadmap. We have it. All the government has to do is implement it. Because the judges already went through an extensive exercise of listening to as many people as they could. So the fact that we have these games being played now just goes to show, again, that there's a lack of political will to address the issues that have led to the assassination of a journalist. So no, we have not changed anything that will prevent this from happening again. Because nothing has changed, and nothing will change in the way things are going forward. They're cosmetic fixes that change absolutely nothing in reality. I don't know if any of you would like to add to that.
Through your lifeline.
Thank you.
Giving me out through your lifeline.
She has a mic. Do you have one?
Apart from being my husband, I worked for this man for many years. I agree totally with what he says about apathy, but the biggest problem for those of us who were trained to tell a story, trained to fact check, trained to make sure we never made an error in anything we reported, is the apathy that has come through our lives through social media. And much as we are in this most nasty situation here, social media has damaged freedom of the press in every country in this world. And I'm sure there's a young lady on this table would agree with me.
I actually wouldn't. No, social media has changed the press freedom landscape around the world, but it's also changed the media. It has given some a chance to report in a way. For example, at Reporters Without Borders, we don't only work on cases of professional journalists, we support non-professional journalists too, and there is some extremely powerful citizen journalism around the world, especially in countries where it's extremely difficult to operate as official media. So
I appreciate that.
In terms of freedom of information, in terms of giving a platform to others who wouldn't have it, it has been revolutionary. It can also be, it has negative implications. In particular, the sort of more negative aspects I work on have to do often with safety of journalists. And Caroline knows this well too. We've spoken in the past at other events about trolling and online abuse and threats, and women journalists in particular do face that side of social media. But it's not so straightforward to say that it's just been negative, because the world is changing and journalism has changed, and who is a journalist? Excuse me. Who is a journalist and what is journalism is sort of being debated in a way that we've never seen before. But I don't think it's all doom and gloom. I think we need better protections for journalists online. I think we need, in particular, the platforms to do more to ensure that women journalists in particular are able to use their platforms without causing additional risks to themselves. But it's not so simple.
I was a women journalist back in the day when
every man swore at me and thought it was
So now we get that. I get that every day online, and it shouldn't be part of the job. It shouldn't. It is.
acceptable to be.
But policymakers and platforms can do more, and so we advocate on those areas as well. But I wouldn't dismiss it because it also opens up new channels to share information, and it's where it enables new audiences as well. Young people are getting their information in very different ways to older generations, so we need to get them information where they're at.
Yeah.
But the problem is with social media. With social media, is that, as my wife said, there's very little. People publish things without fact checking. Other people believe them. That type of social media has damaged a lot of traditional channels of communication in what we consider the old media. Now, the old media, in terms of print journalism, they did train journalists. They trained them to do a job. And those journalists, on a wet Tuesday night, might be at a council meeting in Nashar, as they did, every Tuesday night before them, and it's boring and it's awful. Then they get a little whiff of something, a little whiff of possible corruption. And they record that, and they go back and they write a story about it. But because of the decline of print journalism, that's not happening anymore. That is just not happening. We're not the only country, it's happening all over Europe and wider. Because democracy is more than putting an X in a box every few years. Democracy is about how, back to the point, how people find out what's going on in their country. And that's only done through really serious media channels. And that's why it's so important we keep fighting against these so-called politicians. I don't think they're in it to further our cause, they're in it for themselves. So please keep fighting, because we're losing democracy by the day.
And something else that's happening on the local social media scene is, you're mentioning media literacy. But I think that a lot of them are following the disdain that is being shown by ministers themselves when they evade questions by journalists. So the Times of Malta shares a story on Facebook, and somebody writes, Big Illa News, okay? And then there's a stream of abuse after that. And it's happening all the time, especially to media. We sometimes report something innocuous, like the traffic jams on the Thursday of school. And somebody writes, Big Illa News. Big Illa is a bit made of beans.
Sets the whole direction.
And then it's down the road away from the road.
One quick. Yeah, I'm getting too sorry. That's the point I was going to build on. One of these things that we're coming to is that they need to fight, and I think Republica is at the forefront of the effort to improve our democracy. You have your own FOI battles as well. Please tell us more about it.
Hello everyone, I'm Alessandra from Republica. You said earlier that the climate here in Malta makes it difficult for people to access information. But most people, most ordinary citizens, don't know that they have the right to make these freedom of information requests as well. They think that is only the remit of journalists. In fact, our president, in his capacity as an ordinary citizen, has filed for a freedom of information request regarding Silvio Valletta in February 2020. And to date, nothing has been forthcoming. First off, Robert got to know that the presiding judge in his case was and still is a lawyer for Lord Fenwick. So he asked for her recusal, of course, and she recused herself, but then the new person that was appointed in her stead, we discovered that he was the one to nominate Michel Muscat for the Volunteer of the Year award. So besides being very difficult to acquire information about this particular case, Silvio Valletta in this case, we got to know that he was appointed to the board of the FIU. And we, Robert, actually, wanted to know who was behind this appointment, what maneuvers were carried on, what backroom deals were carried on in the back rooms. And to date, nothing was forthcoming. So these the system is designed to fail. It is a war of attrition, like everything else in the past 5 years, most especially. It is a war of attrition because, as you have perfectly laid out, it discourages people from pursuing information. It is designed that way. It is prohibitively expensive. The legal fees are very high. And by the time that if you acquire this information, if it comes, because if is a huge caveat in this thing, the story would have already become irrelevant. So, you know, to latch on to my introductory comment, people don't know that they have a right to information. They treat the media, journalists, like we're consuming a product, when we, as citizens, can generate this information by asking for it. And it's not people don't know this, or rather they ignore their right, this right to know, not only because of media literacy, the lack of media literacy rather, or the two-party system. It is also because I think as a people we have an unhealthy respect for authority. We're subservient actually. So we feel really uncomfortable to prod and to ask questions, because that's how we were taught, not to ask questions.
Thank you for sharing that. Corinne and Rebecca need to leave us because they have another commitment. Rebecca will join us again in about half an hour. Thank you very much for your time. I think we can close. I'm just going to step down and we can continue talking. Okay. So thank you very much for all this.